I was privileged to see an enormous number of things of both innovations, modern environmental innovations that had a relationship to permaculture in Japan, as well as many traditional examples of sustainability. And I want to run through those as a bit of a travelogue of photos with stories around the theme permaculture in Japan, foreign import or Indigenous design. And I think by the end you'll see the relationship in that title. Flying into Japan, of course, for someone with a deep understanding of breeding landscape, you're immediately dealing with something which is as different as chalk and cheese from Australia, from a geologically old landscape to a geologically young one of enormous fertility, of enormous water resources, and of course, enormous resultant population densities that existed, of course, before the fossil fuel era. Small areas in Japan that are capable of being cultivated. Most of the land, of course, is forest. Travelling around Japan was very different to Australia, in a lot of ways made me feel like I came from a third world country. I have been to Adelaide on the train. There's one train a day from where I live in central Victoria, and it travels at 80 kilometres an hour and is often 2 hours late. The Shinkansen on the trunk routes in Japan travel at 250 kilometres an hour. There's sort of 40 a day or so, and they're always to the minute, much more comfortable than flying in Australia. Of course, the density of settlement on the limited flat areas in Japan is quite extraordinary, but it's perhaps surprising to see that a huge number of Japanese, in spite of the limited space, live in individual houses like Australians do. A little smaller, a little more packed together, but always there's the great industrial sites as well. Interspersed in these landscapes is agriculture, serious, intensive, highly productive agriculture. Wheat here ripening, yields of probably 5 times what Australian farmers produce per hectare. Of course, a lot of that is assisted by more agricultural subsidies for fertilisers, but a lot of it is just a much more fertile and abundant environment. Very small scale agriculture. Average farm size in Japan at the moment is 1.5 hectares, but the government has a policy to shift that to 20 hectares. Whether that's real or not, or just pandering to the Americans, remains to be seen. As I said, most of Japan is covered in forest, and that forest is not some wilderness that is locked up. It's actually mostly managed production forestry, but it's a mosaic of conifers. The dark green is Sugi fir, timber a bit better quality than Western red cedar. It's the most abundant forest tree in Japan. The very light green areas are Moso bamboo, one of the world's most productive timber and other bamboos, and the sort of lumpy green areas are mixed deciduous forest with probably almost as much diversity in them as Australian eucalypt forests. I suppose the great disease of the Japanese landscape is concrete. Partly as a way of boosting the economy, the government puts an enormous amount of money into rural infrastructure development. And it's really hard to get any sort of indication of a geological cross-section in a road cutting or railway cutting in Japan because they're all concreted over. You can see the little walkway along the face of that gives you an indication of the scale. And the control of nature is everywhere. I suppose in English we'd call this topiary. It sort of has some ambiguous relationship to bonsai as well. This is Mr. Matsushita, who was our host from the Permaculture Kyushu group. The Japanese Permies are in a lot of ways a lot better organised than Australians. They have quite well organised events, and this small group has their own office. He was always on the mobile phone while he was leading us around the countryside. For Sue and myself, in travelling to Japan, a lot of what we wanted to see was to understand how much of traditional sustainable culture was still a working, functional system in Japan. My partner Sue, who's lived in Italy for 13 years, is very familiar with a modern affluent society that had actually retained a lot of those traditions, which are in fact a lot of the sources for what we call permaculture design. This was our first breakfast in Japan, miso soup. We had miso soup for breakfast for 4 weeks. Sue was in heaven. I mentioned the infrastructure around the landscape. Heading out to Amakusa, a quite remote area of Kyushu, there's still the industrial construction everywhere, interspersed with the agriculture. And also in the landscape is the extraordinary sustainable traditional examples of past infrastructure, phenomenal stonework, that diagonal stone seawall, walling, you see those patterns everywhere. When you look closely at those blocks, they're not actually perfectly regular, they're all individually fitted. Also along the sea coast, you see the modern developments of aquaculture. These are large impoundments in the bay, Amakusa, sand being spread out as a base for fish farming. Of course, fish is a huge part of the Japanese diet. We were, on this first couple of days, visiting a village where there was a Mr. Nakai, who had been an organic farmer and an organic pioneer in Japan for 30 years. And we were shown this building where his family, who were once the feudal lords of this village, used to take the rice tithe from the peasants. But he was also wanted to immediately show us the wild abundance of Japan, such as this herb and vegetable, which we collected for that night's meal. So this use of the wild is everywhere still in rural Japan. This is Mr. Nakai and his rice paddies, very small, some of them actually within the village area. And he asked me if I wanted to experience what it's like to control weeds via the traditional organic method, using this small, like, water-powered rotary hoe for water, chopping up water weeds. It's amazingly hard to walk through 18 inches of mud and not fall over in the rice row. So the other village people thought it was quite humorous, this white person out in his underpants and t-shirt in the rice paddy. So our second night in Japan was actually staying in what had been his uncle and aunt's house. We have this sense of Japan being incredibly crowded. In rural Japan, there's these enormous numbers of very large houses, often only old people around. There was one woman in her 70s living in this house as a caretaker. Again, this was a house built by a family that had been an elite. And Nakai took it on himself to live an incredibly frugal life as a symbol of his family repentance for the wealth that his family had extracted out of his community over 400 or 500 years. Within the building where we slept, there was this scales, which was the scales that his predecessors used to weigh the rice tithe from the villages. We slept for the first time on traditional thin futon on the tatami mat, which is a very sophisticated, far more evolved sleeping system than anything in the West. And of course, the rice paper screens and the whole way the traditional house works. One of the things I wanted to see in going to Japan that I specifically asked for was to see the forestry systems. and in a lot of ways I was interested in not just looking at sort of alternative, innovative things, but what their mainstream, if you like, industrial forestry was like. And we went up into the mountains behind Miyazaki into an area where the economy is predominantly forestry. And again, there's this mosaic of sugi and other conifers, bamboo and deciduous forest in an extraordinary mosaic. This is industrial logging, Japanese style. It looks more like the forestry we do at our Friars Forest Eco Village. It's an extraordinary steep slope that we could never log in Australia, but the absorbent soils in Japan make that possible. But you can see all the debris has been laid out on the contour, and that slope is a slope that you could barely stand on. And you can see the limited size of the logging coupe. The village of Muritsuka, where we were staying, it's, as I said, its economy is mostly forestry, very small amount of tourism, and just a small amount of, I suppose, what we'd call garden agriculture. Agriculture that's mostly for providing for local community needs and families and relatives. So you can see the slope there and the man with the rotary hoe on the terrace further down, if you don't sort of get giddy and fall off. The terrace retaining walls, the older ones that are dry stone walls, are themselves a really complex ecology that support many wild plants, many of which are medicinal herbs and wild vegetables. I don't know whether you can see that that's actually a stone wall. It's not actually a special rock garden. It's just a stone wall growing lots of beautiful plants. And in the village, we'd been talking about various old-fashioned implements that people used to use in the past. And when we arrived there, the girl said, "Come quickly, here's an old woman who's using one of those things we were talking about." And this garden agriculture in Japan is not just growing fruit and vegetables like we'd see here. People are growing their staples as well. You can see the woman carrying wheat on that backpack and then putting it up on this bamboo rack to dry. When they said old, you know, she's probably in her 70s. The number of people in Japan who are still working the land at an older age is quite extraordinary. We were, of course, treated to most amazing hospitality. And even though we said we want just to eat simple local food, and at this dinner, we're sitting around the charcoal fire pit there, and we were given this sake, which was, I said, you know, very renowned all over Japan. And I said, "But is it local?" And they pointed across the valley. "See that house over there? It's made there." So these were the two foresters who showed us around and where we got into the actual working logging forest. Here's a coupe that's just been freshly logged, and you can see the small logging vehicles there. This is Sugi fir, which is sort of the equivalent, if you like, of radiata pine in terms of its role in the Japanese economy compared with radiata pine in Australia, except, as I said, the wood is better than Western red cedar. These trees are probably 80 years old, about that diameter. They don't grow very fast. And the rotation time of this, their main industrial timber source, is about 80 to 120 years. And the trees have all been very well pruned. So that's a well-managed stand of Sugi fir. The logging equipment is all pretty small. And when you scramble down the slopes, you realise why they have these small chainsaws. And you can see the toe shoes there, these light, I can't remember what they're called, that allow you to sort of grip on the, they're actually reinforced, you know, loggers' toe shoes. And here's the cable logging equipment. And there's someone, one of the workers attaching the cable log onto this, this harvest area. These harvest areas have to be clear fell because they're extraordinarily steep, but the coupes are very small. Now, this is mostly mixed hardwoods that's being pulled out of here. The base logs are used for furniture and other uses, but a huge part of the timber resource here goes for oak for making shiitake mushrooms. And that's one of the larger production places that produces shiitake mushroom, which grows on the oak logs. You can see all the little inoculation points where the mushrooms will start to grow. But shiitake produced in this way is supermarket shiitake, which sells at a cheaper price than the real traditional stuff, which is still made in the forest, which we'll see later. But of course, the most of the wood coming out of Japanese forests goes into the Japanese passion for wood, and a wood house is still very high status in Japan. And increasingly, surprisingly, it's not actually as expensive as it used to be in the past, because Japanese forest resources are getting better and better over the last 30 or 40 years. So here's a house being assembled in the traditional post and beam system. And it's basically a modest house using energy efficient modern design ideas, but traditional construction methods and local wood. And it was to show people that it was possible to have a traditional house that was energy efficient and that was actually lower cost than imported Canadian timber, which is of course all unsustainably managed, that the Japanese also buy. This is another one of his projects. It's a display garden of Japanese medicinal plants, from herbs through to trees. It's partly a tourist project, but it's also a place of maintaining traditional knowledge of herbal medicine. You can see the flow form in that garden. Our next visit was to this young couple who are, I suppose, part of a pioneering edge in Japan of highly educated people moving back to the country, reconnecting with traditions. Kote here, he is an organic farmer in his home village, and this is a house which they managed to buy, even though it's very difficult to buy land or houses in rural Japan because there's nothing for sale. So it's a 400-year-old farmhouse that they managed to buy. His wife is originally from Tokyo, and the old village people think it's amazing that Kote brought back a Tokyo bride to the village. In fact, they are German Japanese translators who have lived overseas for 15 years, and still translating over the internet is part of their work. But they are both passionate about the connection and maintenance of traditions. This is their rice paddies, organic rice, and the weeds here are controlled with carp that are put into the ponds, and then they do sell the carp. There is a bit of a market for carp in Japan, but because Japan's a rich country like Australia, of course, everyone would rather eat seafood and better quality fish. So there's the carp is mainly just a weed control system. They also have cows, a rare local breed of beef cattle, and although they're partly in sheds, they're also out grazing, something that of course we take for granted in Australia but is extremely rare in Japan, to see animals grazing on the land. But again, in this particular region, there's a tradition of that. And here is where they grow their shiitake. So this is shiitake produced in this way, of course, has the highest price in the shops, because people reckon they can taste the difference to the stuff raised under plastic with mist sprayers to the stuff in the forest. And when I got up in the morning, I could hear this repeated sound of splitting, and I went out, and there was Kote's grandfather, who's 92, out doing his morning exercise, splitting bamboo kindling. Just around the corner, he had a shed stacked with what looked like about 3 tons of bamboo kindling. So this, continuity of people still feeling useful right to the end of their life that still exists in rural Japan. there's a sort of basically part of the origin of that topiary, this sculpted plants, which was once part of elite traditional landscaping, Japanese landscaping and temple gardening. But now, of course, every middle-class Japanese with a garden has trees like this. And we later saw where these trees come from at great cost. But the next place was sort of jumping to the other extreme, the place in Japan where the industrial era really got going in Kyushu. And this place was one of the worst polluted places in Japan until the 1970s. And this was the first blast furnace, which started about the same time that Australian heavy industry started in about 1900. But it's now sort of gone through that sort of like Newcastle phenomenon on a much larger scale. It's reinvented itself, cleaned up the environment, and there's a lot of innovative new environmental industries there. One of the places we went to visit was this new building just near that renovated blast furnace, and this was an energy efficient passive solar design house, office, which was one of the best examples of integrated modern design that I saw in Japan. Not enormously extravagant, but the Japanese have a tendency to throw a lot of money at things. And the man who developed this was using it as a display place to teach, but their business was actually public relations. And he ran this public relations company to take the profits to support an environmental organisation, which also was based in the same office. And people later told me that he was the lowest paid person in this business because he said he has all the fun. So he pays his workers a lot more. And unlike a lot of things in Japan, the workers come and their hours are completely free. They can eat, drink on the job, and it was an amazing place. So it's a tendency to think of Japanese society as a very incredibly regimented and conservative, but in a population of 120 million people, there's an extraordinary number of creative, free-thinking innovators who are doing amazing things. One of those who really wanted to see to visit was this man, Mr. Funo. He wrote the book, The Power of Duck, that Bill Mollison published in Australia, about rice duck farming. Here is some of his crops there, wheat and potatoes in the foreground. And here's his wife taking the first duck out of this massive incubator that they produce all the ducklings to put into their rice fields at the right time, and also supply those ducklings to many other organic farmers who use this system in Japan. So the duckling, being the first one, sort of went around in her pocket as we walked around the farm, and then ended up in this pond of azolla, waiting for its mates to get large enough to put out in the rice. But the rice, we didn't see the ducks in the rice at this farm, though we did later on, because here it was just time to start planting the rice. And here's the transplants that we had helped with taking down in the little four-wheel drive down to Funo on his rice planting machine there, which is actually his father's machine made in the 1960s. So that machine is quite small, but still with the very small rice paddies, there's always corners that don't get done. And if you're really meticulous, you get out and sort of do the traditional thing of plant the stuff by hand. So the visitors got the experience of a half an hour sort of bending their backs to put the rice seedlings in, and grateful that we didn't have 20 hectares of it to do. But Funo is experimenting with direct seeding rice, which is a very radical idea in Japan. And here's one of his fields where he has sown the rice the way you would sow wheat. This is his second year of doing this. If this is as successful as it looks like it's going to be, he's going to convert his whole rice seeding to this system, which is quite revolutionary, really. His village is only about 20 houses, and yet even in a village that size, there is a temple. And that village has maintained this temple for hundreds of years. And it's around these temples and shrines where you see really old trees in Japan. although the forests are very well managed and quite long rotation, they are too well managed to see very old trees. Most places there are not the old trees, but this is where you see the old trees. And this is a ginkgo, probably about 500 years old in the foreground, about that diameter. And there's just the little retaining wall holding up that very modest temple. Sort of made me feel like the stonework that I showed in my slides. I said to the Japanese, I'd be very proud to show this photo of stonework to an Australian audience, but after seeing the stonework in Japan, I think this is a very poor, extraordinary craftsmanship. Okay, I mentioned Moso bamboo, this enormously important plant to the traditional economy, and here it is close up. And here's Rick Tanaka's photo that he took standing under that stand. Enormous construction bamboo, but also an enormously productive food plant, everywhere harvested for bamboo shoots. Bamboo charcoal is highly prized, not just along with the oak charcoal for traditional fuels, but also for purifying air and for purifying water. So a lot of the awareness, sort of new environmental and health awareness about the role of charcoal, you go to Japan, the whole systems are all there, all as completely traditional systems. Always have been, of course, went through a bit of a demise in the affluent industrial period, now being revived very much. So you can see those bamboo charcoal coming out of the charcoal kiln. Moving from Kyushu to Honshu, we visited a few projects called Satayama projects, which are basically, you'd call them Japanese land care, I suppose. But instead of going out in the countryside and planting trees, here these town people from the local city of Nara have gone up into this valley where there's only old people who have abandoned the rice terraces, and the moso and other bamboos and forest have grown over those rice terraces, and they are cutting back the native forest to recover agriculture. Maintenance of tradition. This separation that we take for granted here between what we think of as nature and people doesn't really exist in Japan. They don't have this disease that we have of this separation. They see themselves as a part of nature. And I said, oh, well, what's wrong with letting the moso grow over those rice terraces? And in fact, these dry stone walls are 350 years old. And it would only take 20 or 30 years more of that moso to tear all of those stone walls apart. So that's a cultural heritage, but there's also some cultural intelligence in that the Japanese retain, that they might need this land for food growing in the future again. And so it should be retained in agriculture. But of course, as people are out doing all this free labour, if you like, the bush they're working in is a bush that provides an abundance of wild foods. And of course, they're thinning out the oak forest, chainsawing down trees to let the bigger trees grow, and growing more shiitake mushrooms to take home to their place, and harvesting bamboo shoots and having picnics. So this engagement with land and working with nature has these natural rewards, which is part of that abundance that exists in Japan. At Kyoto University, we stayed at a traditional guest house and had a look at a lot of the beautiful architecture in that area. But it was also interesting to see a lot of the more modest things, like this bit of stone wall with mud brick on the top and tile around what had been just an old farmhouse, which was now quite an affluent area. And next to that, here is a farmer irrigating his crops. And immediately across the road, these women are harvesting a serious commercial onion crop. This is within one of the most affluent cities in Japan. So this integration of agriculture, small-scale agriculture, still all existing, which government policies have as an aim to wipe out. and fill all those rice fields in, put houses on them to satisfy the American demands for the Japanese to take down their trade barriers. But there are many, many oppositional voices. This man, Tsushida, has just retired from teaching at the university, and part of his course he teaches students about re-engaging with agriculture. They have basically gardens there. He's been a pioneer of the simply living, frugal living movement in Japan since the early 1970s. And Rick Tarnica wanted me to meet him and record our discussions and comparisons between environmental ideas in Australia and New Zealand, Australia and Japan. And I think that's an extraordinary thing, that the amount of traditional knowledge that still exists in Japan, I believe, probably exceeds that of any affluent country in the world, and possibly most poor countries, because amazingly enough, in most third world countries, so many of these traditions of sustainability have actually already been obliterated. But the Japanese have managed to hang on to theirs in spite of their engagement and role in the modern economy. An example of the challenge that I would throw out to people in this region involved in permaculture, this is the region of Australia where we could have sustainable rain-fed rice production. Instead of our totally unsustainable rice, which is grown with 24 megalitres per hectare of water in the near desert regions in central New South Wales. Furno's rice duct system is the perfect example of permaculture integration, where the ducts are used in the fields to control pests, control weeds, and are a saleable harvest. And that's an example of not a traditional Japanese system, but an evolved modern environmental innovation, which is one of the best examples of permaculture that I've come across. And obviously Bill Mollison thought the same thing when he decided to have translated and published Furno's work under his Tagari permaculture publishing imprint. So that's one great example of something that could be brought back here from Japan. Yeah, Furno is connected to many of the other rice duct farming networks around Southeast Asia. In a lot of ways, rice duct farming is bigger in Southeast Asia. Furno said to me, trouble in Japan is the Japanese don't eat much in the way of duck. So whereas in Vietnam and China and other places, this is actually a very, very popular way of farming without chemicals. Well, what I noticed in Japan is for a country that's incredibly rich and has very high agricultural subsidies, the amount of herbicide that seemed to be used in their land management was maybe proportionally a small fraction of what we use here. They mostly use natural management, and they pay people to cut stuff. They pay high wages and have people who are highly skilled to do jobs that here we would say, oh no, that could only happen in a poor country where wages are very low, because they recognise that that there's a whole lot of higher skill values in employing people, combining it with good technology, but also there's a key factor that drives the Japanese economy towards employing labour rather than energy and technology, is that fuel prices are double what they are here, and electricity prices are triple. And so a lot of the really positive, sensible things just naturally occur because they've had, ever since the Second World War, the energy costs have actually been much higher than they are here. So they pushes the whole economy towards these more sustainable solutions.